Bismillah walhamdulillahi wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillahi. We wanted to focus on a specific point that is very important. Many of us are going through challenges. And we know that at the core of belief, if we go with the definition of Iman as being that conviction which we have in our hearts, which we confess with our tongues, and then action that follows, we know that belief, an essential part of it, is action. One of the issues that we confront, which is extremely problematic, is that a lot of what we are facing as far as major challenges in the world requires a transformation amongst people themselves that is not just spiritual. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, one of the things that we find when we deal with the reality of Mecca and Medina in the early da'wah in its various phases, meaning in the early generation, was that at a certain point there had to be a transformation that took place not only spiritually but amongst the people themselves and how they organize themselves and organize their lives. The affair is not just one to remain within the spiritual realm. In other words, we can't, for instance, if we're going through a struggle when it comes to issues of food, yes, we make dua, yes, we depend upon Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala, but at the end of the day, there has to be some sort of plan that we're engaged in to look at the situation of how it is that we're going to deal with the crisis of food, as an example. And we take that law in every situation that we confront, except when it comes to religion, unfortunately. There's some people, yes, that they make an effort and then we find that they don't have the spiritual backing, so to speak. But there has to be a balance somewhere between our spiritual dependency upon Allah wa ta'ala and effort that we make. A matter of fact, I argue that some of us, we have experienced what it means for Allah wa ta'ala to intervene in our lives. Allah wa ta'ala has intervened in the lives of some of us in situations in such a way that we can say that is almost miraculous. There's situations in which Allah wa ta'ala has liberated us from conditions which are extremely problematic, situations in which we don't even know how we came out of those situations. And so that it's not that we're not having a relationship with Allah wa ta'ala, but we find ourselves constantly confronting problems in our material reality. We constantly find ourselves confronting problems in our interpersonal relationships. We constantly find ourselves confronting problems that are economic, and in some cases political. And so we can make dua as much as we want. We can make salah as much as we want. And sure, that's going to help us elevate our iman. But that's not necessarily the case that is going to transform the conditions that are before us. The matter or the affair in the deen is also enjoining the good and forbidding the evil. It's not just the issue of praying salah and giving zakat. Although if we were to give zakat, it would eliminate a lot of the problems that we see within the Muslim ummah overall when it comes to issues of poverty. And so there has to be a balance between the spiritual and the material. But the reality is that if the material suffers, the spiritual will suffer as well. We can't have constantly a spirituality which is a spirituality only of spiritual greatness being and taking on problems and suffering. We have to come to some sort of orientation in which we are solving our problems, the problems that we face. Because spirituality can't just be to help us through moments of suffering only. Spirituality should be also there to allow us to grow and to develop, to cultivate, to advance, to evolve. If religion is only there to give us meaning for suffering and problems, then that means that there's something problematic with the way that we're dealing with the world. Religion can't only be there only to give us a sense of meaning because we're having problems. That becomes an issue where now we're having a crutch on religion to give us a sense of meaning in a situation that we may feel disempowered that we can't change. When in reality, we were put on this earth by Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, إِنِّي جَعِلٌ فِي الْأَرْضِ خَلِيفَةً. That Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala put us on the earth as vicegerents. There has to be some sense of empowerment. Empowerment just can't be for those who have wealth and those who have power. That's a problem. If empowerment means only those who have wealth in the dunya, and only those who have position in the dunya are capable of making a difference in the world, then where does that leave the majority of humanity that is suffering conditions which are extremely problematic? Human beings should have the ability, if we talk about being free, to better our situation and better our conditions. And so what has happened is that we're restricted to only practicing religion when it comes to the situation of suffering and comes to the situation that we find ourselves in issues and problems. But we're not coming back to religion to see how it is that it calls us to develop ourselves. It calls us to deal with our issues and our problems. And this is part of the situation that we're confronted when it comes to how do we deal with the COVID-19 problem. Some of us will just deal with this from the angle of dua, from the angle of prayer. Others realize that it's a combination of prayer and a combination of taking the path of science, trying to figure out what our solutions is. The same thing with the issue of poverty. It's the same thing with the issue of oppression. It's the same thing with the issue of education. We have to be balanced people. Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala in revealing the Quran, one of the things that Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala called us to is Iqra. Bismi alladhi khalaq. To read in the name of the one who created. Right? And then Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala continues to talk about the creation of the human being. Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala continues to talk about the situation of education. In other words, Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala in the beginning of the revelation is calling us to have an understanding of who we are and an understanding of the world that we live in and an understanding that we have to comprehend what is going on in that world. What are the processes which control that world? And part of Iman is to have an understanding that Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala didn't just put us in the world powerless, but gave us the capacity to understand the world and the capacity to transform it. And that capacity of understanding and that capacity of transformation, it has to be one in which we acknowledge who Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala is, and we have to develop ourselves. But if we're escaping in religion constantly just as a mental therapy to alleviate us of our sufferings in that way, then we're not taking religion from the angle of empowerment. We're not taking religion from the angle of boosting our situation. There's certain things that we have to realize are in place. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he guided the community. Mecca was a situation in which the community was broken apart. And in guiding the community by way of revelation, we find that Medina was a situation in which the community was being reconstructed. And so that's the same thing that we say. Islam is not only addressing us in situations in which we're falling apart, but Islam is also calling us to reconstruct, rebuild, reorganize, rejuvenate. Islam is calling us to not just be a people that we depend upon Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, but Islam is calling us to be a people that we act while we're depending upon Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. And that's the dilemma that many of us have. The dilemma that many of us have is that we're trying to figure out how is it that we can act in the world when we find ourselves disempowered? How can we function in the world when we find ourselves disoriented? We can't just keep coming back to just spiritual solutions and just saying that, well, Allah will remove this condition from us. So Allah challenges us from the angle of what are you going to do? Right? And so the situation that we find is that when Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala is putting us to the test, Allah tells us, Ayyukum ahsana amala, to see who it is from among you that has the best of deeds when that test comes. Who among you has the best of deeds? And those deeds are not solely restricted to the issue of dua or the issue of spiritual development, but those deeds are also coming back to see who of you is going to be concerned with the situation of others. Who of you is going to be concerned with building? We find in Umar radiallahu anhu examples in which he was concerned for the well-being of the community. One of the most beautiful things about Islam is that we see that in Islam, the leadership that was there amongst the companions was a leadership that dealt with the affairs of the community, the material and the spiritual affairs. It did not just deal with the spiritual affairs, but what has transpired for all of these years is that we're only concerned with the spiritual affairs, and the material affairs, we just let them be. And this is why the Muslims are in the condition that they're in. This is why the world is in the condition that they're in. The people of the world. That we separate between values and what we have to do in the world. We separate between organizing ourselves and the values that the deen calls us to. And this is always the issue that we're confronting on a regular basis. You know, we're separating between life and iman. And the more that we keep separating between life and iman, we find that our lives are rooted in situations and in problems which they could be solved if we had the right material organization of our situations. If the companions left that environment of Mecca to go to Medina, it was because the material conditions didn't allow them to flourish spiritually. Right? The material conditions in Mecca didn't allow the early believers to flourish spiritually. So they went into an environment. Even before going to Medina, they went into the environment of Habasha because the material conditions in that environment allowed them to flourish spiritually. And so I want to end on this note of saying that, look, at a certain point, we're going to have to confront our material situation, because this is what is plaguing many of us. Our material situation is one which is impinging upon our ability to develop and grow and evolve, and is choking out our spirituality. When you have a situation of dominance, which materialism is dominance, which there's no care for the poor, you have a situation in which people, the way that they organize them, doesn't allow for people to grow and to develop. That is going to choke out your sense of hope. It's going to choke out your ability to function in the world. And it's going to push conditions of values and moral breakdown. Look at places in which there's poverty and materialism dominance. Look at what begins to happen in those environments. In those environments in which people are focused on their own survival. Look at what happens in those environments, how those environments become crime-ridden environments. Those environments become environments of desperation. Those environments become environments in which religion is not able to transform the condition of the people. And in many of those environments, there's tons of churches and mosques and other organizations of religiosity, and still there's no transformation in the people. And that was not the condition with Islam. Islam came to uplift the conditions of the people on multiple levels. That's why in the Quran is always mentioned the command to Salah and Zakat, because it's a spiritual and a material upliftment of the condition of the people. So a lot of us, we find ourselves in frustration, and many times that frustration is coming because there's not a balance between these two realms. We can't continuously hide in religiosity and think that our conditions are just going to change by just making dua by itself. Dua is powerful, and we're obligated to make dua. Yes, Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala can change any condition. Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala right now in an environment that's raining can stop it from raining and bring out the sun. The sun can come from the west and change its orbit. But is that the rationale that we're taught? Or are we taught the rationale that we have to be the people that have an understanding of how everything falls in this place, and we have to look at the cause and the effect, and every event from the beginning of the affair we say Bismillah, meaning that we're moving with Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. People's dropping in iman is because of the types of suffering that they're going through. These sufferings which shouldn't be the case if there was actual community. These sufferings which shouldn't be the case if there was an actual concern for building people up. But our understanding of deen has become spiritualized. It's not a deen of empowering, right? It's not a deen in which is empowering. If we say that deen is a way of life, that way of life encompasses not only our belief in the unseen, but it's a way of life which calls us to cultivate the seen. How is it that we can give zakat if there's no agriculture? How can we give zakat if there's no husbandry? How can we give zakat if there's no economic development from the angle of trade and so on and so forth? So even when it comes to the issue of zakat itself, that is telling us that the deen is rooted in this reality that we have to look at the whole of life, even the situation of Salah. Why is there Salat al-Jum'ah? Why is there a break from the marketplace? Because there is such a thing as the marketplace. Because the Muslims were concerned with organizing themselves, so they had a lifestyle in which there was a marketplace, and then a lifestyle in which they could take a break from the marketplace to be able to congregate for the Salah. But if we're telling people congregate for the Salah and you figure out how you make your way to it, and when the people fall short and they're struggling, that's because we never organize ourselves to build that type of community. A community which has the ability to organize itself economically and spiritually in a way which can represent the values of Islam. And that's the same thing. We see that over and over again in many situations. How long are we going to think that we're not going to have problems in our marriage, in our families, in our communities with the type of organizations that we have? And I'm not talking about institutions. I'm talking about the way that we're organizing our lives as a community. Of course, we're going to have problems in our marriages. Of course, we're going to have problems in our communities, because the type of organization of our lives, the way that it is not suitable for the development of Iman. It's not suitable for the development of a human being which claims to believe in Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala and the Messenger. It's an organization in which everyone is fending for himself or herself to survive and keep on and hold to the basics of Iman. And that's why you see the conditions of the people as they are. So of course we're going to have breakdowns in Iman. Of course we're going to have a crisis of faith. Of course we're going to have family problems. Of course we're going to have a broken community, because the organization is not right. It's not an understanding. It is not an organization of the community which is truly representative of the prophetic spirit. The prophetic spirit spoke to the whole of the human being. The Quran spoke to the whole of the human being. And at the end of the day, what we face is that each person is struggling with trying to understand how to practice Iman on their own. So when we say وَتَوَصَّلْ بِالْحَقِّ وَتَوَصَّلْ بِالصَّبْرِ in Surah Al-Asr, we're talking about a community which knows themselves and their direction, a community which has an orientation, a community which has leadership, a community that wants to work together, a community that's supportive, a community that's struggling with itself. Other than that, we can't talk about community. We can talk about individuals trying to figure out how to practice Iman, and that's what we have. And sometimes we have people that come together, but these are not communities of Iman. Because communities of Iman represent the values of Iman, and Iman is not just the issue of Aqidah. Iman represents the whole of the deen. Iman represents the ability of a community to facilitate for itself, to ease the affairs of the believer. A community which gathers the zakat and understands who the poor are. A community which trades and barters amongst itself. That's the reality. But those ideals will remain ideals because we've lost the real significance of what it means to be community, and we've lost the significance of deen. And for the moment, each individual is trying to figure out what it is that they can contribute. And these are the stress points that we have. And so I went further than what I wanted to go. But I want to say this, that as long as this is the state and the affair and the condition of people, be easy with each other. Be easy with each other, because people are suffering on multiple levels, and you're not going to solve their issues solely by giving people spiritual advice. You can't correct the situation of a people if they're suffering from hunger, if they don't have stability in their life. هَذَا بَلَدٌ أَمِينٌ, the Quran says, and describes a place in which it is a place of security and stability, right? And so if the Quran describes security as essential to life, then where is that in our lives? Where is stability in our lives? So when people are going through these tests and these trials and tribulations, we have to be careful that we're just, we're not just giving spiritual advice. People have material conditions that they're contending with that impact their spirituality. It doesn't mean that they don't have spirituality. It doesn't mean that they don't have a relationship with Allah. That's a judgment on the part of many people. Don't judge people because they're suffering in their material conditions as being deficient in Iman, unless you're willing to stand by them in their material conditions. unless you're willing to grab them by the hand and help them go get a job, unless you're willing to give them zakat, unless you're willing to get them medical attention, unless you're willing to feed them, if you're not willing to be there by their side, where's your iman at? Where is your iman in assisting the believers and alleviating their conditions? After so many people talk about the issue of the imam in the community, the leader in the Muslim community. The leader in the Muslim community is the one that was looking after the affairs of the people. Isn't that the example of Umar? When we talk about the series Urtuqul, isn't he the one that was looking at the affairs of the believers? And so we can't separate these things from people's conditions. We have to be very careful. We have to be supportive of people. People are in crisis situations, and it's not just going to go away by wishing it away, and it's not just going to go away by only making dua. We're being challenged to see what it is that we do to transform the conditions of a people. You just can't tell a person that's starving or a person that's going through a struggle, I'll make dua for you and that's it, and think that you've completed. That may be the only thing that you have, but you're the one that's deficient. Because there's nothing there to give. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he alleviated the conditions of the believers, even if he had to take out a loan to alleviate their conditions. That's something of a lesson that we have to remember, that we have to look at these two dynamics. And if we look at those two dynamics, we'll feel ourselves under pressure to build. We'll feel ourselves under pressure that something has to be done. We'll feel the desperation that the people that are struggling feel. Assalamu alaikum.